Hello and welcome to another special Unsourced Wall production. We're continuing with this run of spooky October themed videos. We'll look at one of the most uneven and inconsistent horror comic sagas that I've ever had the displeasure and the immense honor to read. That's right, we're talking about the highly controversial, highly lambasted, and yet highly acclaimed run of Alan Moore's Lovecraftian sagas over at Avatar Press, which, if you've never heard of it before, basically consists of the 2-issue The Courtyard, the 4-issue Neonomicon, and the astounding 12-issue epic known as Providence, plus a few odds and ends to even things out. Now, I'm not really going to be digging into things in a sort of scholarly way that some more comics deserve, mainly because a few of these don't, but also I'm not particularly scholarly in general. If that kind of in-depth comic criticism is what you're after, there are plenty out there I can warmly recommend. That said, I will be tackling these as a Lovecraft fan. I've been an avid reader of Lovecraft since I was like 12, and instantly fell in love with the eerie, vivid, and atmospherically all-encompassing tone his stories be written in. So as we dig into these comics, I hope you all know it's coming from a place of equal love and confusion. Part 1. Alan Moore's Yuggoth Cultures. Alan Moore's Yuggoth Cultures is an anthology series that showcased black and white short stories inspired by Moore and his works that were related to Lovecraft and his works, sometimes very tenuously related. It was actually released the same year as The Courtyard, but for the purposes of this overview, we'll take a look at that one later. The reason I bring up the anthology at all is that, while not officially a part of Moore's Lovecraft saga, it contains the short comic story Recognition, which pairs the creative team of every other part in the saga together for the first time, Moore and Jason Burroughs, but is also basically this accidental prologue to the series as a whole. The short story is more or less a character piece about the last salient days in the life of Lovecraft's father, Winfield Lovecraft, who went mad from advanced syphilis. The story postulates the ironically dramatic idea that even though Winfield was absent for much of Lovecraft's life, that his STD-induced madness wasn't too dissimilar from the type of insanity that Lovecraft would eventually write about in his stories, and that through that, either by happenstance, their shared bond, or direct inspiration, they were connected. Now, this is meant to be a pretty grounded story. The flares it uses, like Winfield's incoherent babbling sounding like Neonomicon spells, are just there for a thematic flourish. That said, given how the actual Lovecraft saga would later reveal how deep the connection between the two ran, and give its own explanation for Lovecraft Sr.'s madness, it works in pretty wonderfully, and is in general a harmless and inconsequential read in its own right. I dig it either way you interpret it. It's short and sweet. Part 2. The Courtyard on Neonomicon. So, some background. The Courtyard is actually based on a short story written by Moore in the 90s. He didn't have any real involvement in its comic adaptation, but I figured that since Avatar had the license to a bunch of his stuff like this, and was already using his branding for the aforementioned anthology mini, why the hell not, right? Neonomicon, however, is Moore's first actual foray into this trilogy as the real writer, but by his own admission, he basically only accepted the gig to pay his taxes. Both stories take the concept that they take place in a setting where not only are they extensions of Lovecraft's own universe of stories, referencing events, years, and characters from the stories as their own history, but also that Lovecraft and his stories existed alongside them, which is, on the surface, a really cool idea. Unfortunately, it's handled and executed with all the skill and tact of a low-rung Hellraiser direct-to-video sequel, specifically something like Hellworld, the one where Pinhead is a character in a video game. What I mean by that is that, like those kinds of movies, the plot is your bare-bones style of flimsy pretexts for just sex and graphical situations, rather than, trying to be scary or intricate or have any kind of story. The Courtyard gets off a little easier since it's based on a short story and Moore had little involvement in how it turned out, but Neonomicon has no excuse. Putting aside the very misguided and honestly wrong-headed plot about sexual abuse, torture, and rape that seems to be the bread and butter of Avatar Press Comics, it's also just the worst representation of Lovecraftian tone and style I have ever seen. Supernatural did a better job, honestly. The story it tells could have been something out of any of the hundreds of horror fetish comics out there, with its odd inclusion of sex addiction as backstory and a very embarrassingly revealing orgy to boot, that the moments it takes to just bluntly drop in references to story titles, character names, locations, and even direct quotes just feel embarrassing and amateurish. I mean, I got secondhand cringe from this. Now, given what the comic does, this might seem like a nitpick, but it always irritated me that Moore said that his inclusion of all of this was because of how sexless and possibly asexual Lovecraft stories were. And there's a lot of criticism you can make about Lovecraft stories, and out of those, the sexual element is on the lowest rung, and even then, it would probably help not to write it like a bored 12-year-old. So why even make a video about this trilogy if I'm not all that hot about the stories within it? Well, the answer is easy. Part 3. Providence. Providence is one of the most shocking series that Avatar Alan Moore ever produced, due to the sheer amount of heavy lifting it does to make this entire saga worthwhile. Especially given that the original pitch for the series, and I'm paraphrasing here, seemed to be more thinking, Wouldn't it be funny if the protagonist in the Lovecraft story was gay and Jewish, and then trying to go from there? But in all honesty, it does everything that Courtyard and Neonomicon either neglected to do or failed to do, since not only does it do more with the idea of introducing a sexual quotient into Lovecraft stories without making it lurid or exploitative by much, but also takes the time to engage with actual modern critical evaluations of Lovecraft stories, the failings and flaws in terms of race, social perspectives, and bigotry. However, Moore plays a very skillful game in including this type of critical lens without robbing the stories of any actual potency or horror that they had. He's able to mesh both its original themes and outlook and a more nuanced one without feeling pandering or lecturing. But what makes her the biggest uptick in quality is that in a way, all the comics in this Lovecraft saga show the growth in talent and skill of artist Jason Burrows. From YouGov Cultures to Courtyard, Neonomicon, and then Providence, they amassed such a breadth of experience that they distinguish themselves, in my opinion, as one of the premier Lovecraft artists there ever were. A lot of Lovecraft art out there focused too much on the strange and the unimaginable, which Burrows also did, but what I feel separates Burrows from most is that they can pinpoint the horror of the subtle and the mundane. When you get down to it, a lot of Lovecraft stories are stuffy and a little bit meandering. He's very much, as the internet would put it, a words writer. And it's that aspect that Burrows captures perfectly with how dull and flat a lot of the imagery in Providence is. It just juxtaposes excellently with the tone and overarching horror of the narrative, holding down its own eerie tone without having to exaggerate or go cartoonish. And that's what a lot of Lovecraft feels like to read. So yeah, this is a comic that, thanks to the art, feels like reading what it's meant to evoke in the best ways possible. As for the narrative that Moore constructs, it's honestly pretty impressive. It's full of the same tricks he pulled out for Watchmen and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in how he uses proxies and references to flesh out an imaginative world, but thanks to the fact that it's centered mostly on a single writer's body of work, it's a lot more cohesive. Lovecraft had tried to weave together a common framework for a few of his stories, mostly as Easter eggs, but Moore takes these to their ultimate conclusion. It kind of makes Lovecraft Country feel more like an actual living environment and a universe than it ever has. And it uses that to its biggest advantage, since if you've never read a Lovecraft story in your life, this would either be the most helpful primer you could ever use, or be the only thing you need to read. It's that encompassingly definitive. That, and well, to get to Moore's original pitch, protagonist of Providence does end up being a smart choice to have made. Not only do they work as a simple proxy of writer Robert Bloch and Lovecraft's own crossover with his literary works, but also as a representative of all of Lovecraft's contemporaries and friends that would be disillusioned by the author. I'm talking mainly about the writer and poet Samuel Loveman, who is referenced in this series and so exists in the comics universe, but I also feel the main character is definitely an embodiment of Loveman's impact on Lovecraft's life. As a fellow writer and friend who has thoroughly disgusted to learn the extent of Lovecraft's hatred of those like him. It adds the necessary final punch needed in a series that succeeds in walking the fine line of Lovecraft stories and their inherent moral fringes. Providence attempts to analyze, but not to excuse, and it's pretty thrilling to read in terms of emotional engagement. And well, as for how this affects all the other previous entries in this series, it only does so in retrospect. It doesn't literally rewrite Courtyard and Neonomicon to be better, but it adds enough backstory and foundation to try and glimpse a more nuanced story going on behind the scenes. Like, a headcanon of mine about Neonomicon is that it's meant to be written and read through the lens of a culture that has been completely inured to Lovecraft, and has made his stories garishly commercialized and commonplace, which is why it's littered with forest references, because that's the kind of world that the narrative of Providence aimed to create. Is that bullshit? Yeah, probably, but Providence has enough going on that it opened that idea up, and it slots in well enough. All that said, Providence isn't perfect. The ending kind of falls apart, and it's an ending that Moore has ripped off from himself like 3 different times, so it offers nothing truly unique either, but it's still a wonderfully unsettling and unnerving series, even if it takes a while to get there. Part 4. Now what? Well, I recommend checking these out. Maybe not in release order, but I think that if you skim through Providence, especially if you're a Lovecraft fan, then it couldn't hurt. Providence itself is self-contained enough, even towards the end, and that the rest is unnecessary to read. But if you want to give it a whirl, more power to you. And, reading all of them is how I reread it. But don't say I didn't warn you. And either way, I hope you find something really spooky to read this holiday season. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought about these stories, if you read them, or if you're going to read them. And yeah, hope you had a great one. See you again next time, and have a good one.